Hey, good evening. Just sitting here on the shores of Yellowstone Lake, enjoying a Lewis and Clark Brewing Company Miner's Gold Hefeweizen. And as I'm sitting here, I was thinking about this place. They call this lake is supposed to be like the main caldera of what's possibly the world's largest volcano here at Yellowstone. And made me think about how it's a really harsh, unforgiving place, this Yellowstone National Park, of bears and bison and elk, but it's also a fair land. And it reminds me of a man, a man named Kettleman, a harsh, unforgiving man who's fair and is kind when he needs to be. And as I was sitting here, I was just wanted to continue the adventures of Kettleman, now known as Jim Flint, here in Chapter 8 of Louis L'Amour's Flint. Last time we left Flint, he was interrupting Porter Baldwin's lunch at the hotel. And in fact, Flint did not finish his meal. Brief as was the exchange with Port Baldwin, it left him restless and irritable. He was aware that his whole manner had reverted to what it might have been had he remained in the West. Outside, the night was cool and the stars were out. He glanced to right and left along the street, feeling the old wariness returning. During the years he had traveled with the first Flint, he had never been without his wariness. Although he was never allowed in the vicinity of a killing, nor told exactly what his benefactor was doing. Always he was left in some lonely spot to care for the horses. It was a good thing to have fresh horses where a man knew they would be. He felt better after he had eaten. The pains did not bother him so much. Perhaps this was the onset of that feeling of well-being he had been told to expect when the end was drawing near. He did not feel like a dying man. His mind accepted the verdict, but the blood in his veins flowed as always, and the night wind tasted as good. It was only when the pains came and the retching, only when he found the blood on his lips, that he could believe it with his body as well. He crossed the walk and stepped into the saddle, turning down street. As he did so, a man moved from the shadows not far away and started up the back stairs of the hotel. Flint recognized the tall, lean man from the train, and from talk he had overheard, he figured this would be Buck Dunn. On impulse, Flint turned his mare sharply and walked her to the foot of the stairs. "Buck Dunn!" The man turned warily. Dimly visible in the faint light from the hotel windows, he peered at Flint from under his hat brim. Flint knew that his own face was equally invisible, although he sat plainly in the light from the front window of the hotel. "Buck Dunn, leave the K-bar alone. I'm telling you now. I will not tell you again." Buck Dunn was a man who killed for money, and carefully with no desire to risk himself. "I don't know as I've heard of the K-bar," Buck Dunn replied. "Who might you be?" "I'm Flint." That name would mean more to Buck Dunn than the others, for he would know the legend and much of the fact around that name. "I'd say you were a mite young. Seems to me Flint would be, well, maybe 60 years old now." "Maybe." Flint turned his mare. "I think we understand each other, Buck Dunn. This is no challenge, just a piece of advice. I doubt if either of us really wants to fight the other." He walked the mare down the street and out of town. Buck Dunn stood on the shadowed stairs and watched him go. How old had Flint been? The trail crew of the 3X were supposed to have killed him in the fight at the crossing, years ago. But no body ever was found. When the lights went on, Flint was gone, as well as the kid. This might not be the original Flint, but if a man prepared for the worst, he saved himself a lot of trouble. When Buck Dunn shot Ed Flynn, he had him dead to rights till Flynn's horse started acting up. It was the first time Buck Dunn had failed to make a kill. He was not a superstitious man, but there might be a sign in that failure. He had better leave K-Bar alone. Buck Dunn went up the stairs to one of the hotel rooms. For an instant, he stood inside the door listening. He was sitting on the bed in the dark when Baldwin came in. "You sent for me?" Buck Dunn said. Baldwin took out a cigar, then offered one to Buck Dunn, who accepted it. "We have to move faster. I want Tom Nugent." "All right. And I want a K-Bar rider. Choose your own. I want to scare that girl out of there. No. Baldwin looked at him past the glow of a match. I've been warned off K-Bar by a man who seems to be interested there. Flint? What does it matter? He isn't important. Now that's a question. Mr. Baldwin, there was a man in my business named Flint. That was some years back. That man was a marvel, Mr. Baldwin. Every job was clean and smooth. He's dead? Briefly, Buck Dunn outlined the events of the crossing. This might be the same man. If he is, and if he starts gunning, he could be trouble. Are you afraid? Baldwin's tone was sarcastic. I'm a businessman, Mr. Baldwin, in a business where I cannot do a good job if I have to worry about my back. Whether there is any connection with the old Flint or not, this one is unpredictable, as you have reason to know. All right, leave him to me. Sure. Buck Dunn got to his feet. Mr. Baldwin, I'd lay off the K-Bar if I were you. He might start hunting, and you'd be a sitting duck. Baldwin started to make an angry reply, but Buck Dunn interrupted. You've been standing in front of a lighted window for several minutes. If I had been hunting you, you'd be dead. I take a professional interest, and you ain't used to a rifle country, Mr. Baldwin. You take care of Nugent, Baldwin replied sharply. I will take care of myself. All right, but you better pay me for that Flynn job. And my advice on Nugent? You don't trust me? This ain't a trusting business, Mr. Baldwin. You don't trust nobody, especially if they stand in front of windows. I don't get far, Mr. Baldwin, with a claim against your estate. Buck Dunn stepped out of the door when his money was paid, closing it so softly there was no sound. Baldwin listened for footsteps, but heard nothing. Taking off his coat and loosening his stiff collar, Baldwin propped a couple of pillows behind him and sat on the bed to think. Flint worried him. Buck Dunn's odd manner worried him still more, but stirred his impatience also. Flint turned the mare out to pasture. The big red horse was feeding close by. Flint held out sugar to him, but the red horse would not take it from his fingers, although he accepted it from the flat rock within a yard of Flint. The second piece the stallion took from his fingers, after stretching his nose forward, toward the sugar several times. Later that afternoon, Flint managed to get a hand on the stallion's shoulder, talking to him gently. Still later, he rubbed his back and scratched under his mane. Proximity and sugar were slowly winning him over. That night, Flint slept a sound sleep for the first time in months, and awakened thinking of Nancy Kerrigan and their long talks during his stay at the ranch. He shaved, dressed in fresh clothing, and considered the situation. The thing to do was break Port Baldwin from the New York end. He thought for a minute, weighing possible allies in New York, the voting power of his stock, and other factors. He saddled the mare, taking him out to pet the stallion, and even to pull himself half on the red horse's back. The stallion sidestepped a little, but seemed more concerned with getting more sugar than the objecting to the handling. He was quite sure he could ride the red stallion when he wanted to. Hey, go away, I'm doing something. Yeah, sorry guys, that's my brother. He's interrupting. I told him what I was doing. Leading the mare, Flint went down the outer passage through the lava and was within a few yards of the trail when he heard voices. There were 7 riders. They were Baldwin men. Hey, Jim, I got to finish reading this book to the guys from the Boundary Waters trip. Sorry, back to the story. Nothing lay in the direction they were taking but the K-Bar, unless they were going to Horse Springs, which was unlikely. Waiting a few minutes, he led the mare out, brushed away the tracks, and stepped into the leather. The sky was tufted with bits of white cloud. The air was clear and the sun was warm. In Alamitos, on that morning, Porter Baldwin was opening a land office, advertising for sale cattle ranches, dry farms, and town site lots. In New York, Lottie Kettleman had found out that her husband had disappeared. Near the lava beds, Flint was trailing the 7 Baldwin riders. They held to a tight bunch, riding slowly to stir no dust cloud. When they disappeared into the trees beyond North Plain, he took a direction diagonally away from them, but once under the cover of the trees, he turned north and rode swiftly to make up for time lost. Their destination was now obvious. They were headed for the K-Bar headquarters. Flint could see the highest peak of the Zuni Mountains dead ahead and knew that peak lay northwest from the K-Bar. He thought of attempting to reach the ranch ahead of them, but doubted if the old mare would stand the run. He rode with extreme care, holding his rifle across the saddle and ready for action. It was a custom-made rifle, built by a man who made weapons for the Grand Duke Alexis and others, and possessed extraordinary range and accuracy. The Baldwin riders were holding close to the lava beds, so he rode wide, using every bit of cover, and gained some ground. He was on the north slope of the Zuni Mountains when he came within sight of K-Bar, and glimpsed a dust cloud far away to the north, indicating a second group of riders. He stepped up his pace, cutting down the hillside and gaining a little ground by virtue of terrain. The riders along the lava bed started to trot their horses, and as if by prearrangement, those at the foot of the Zunies did also. "All right, girl," he said to the mare. "Let's see if you can run." He walked her out of the trees and started down the slope. He was at the apex of a triangle with riders coming up both sides towards him. The mare started to trot. So far, he had not been seen. Sensing his urgency, she began to go faster and faster. Now they were within sight of the ranch and on level ground. From behind, he heard a shout, then a shot. The range was too great, and he was not worried, but the mare stretched out and began to run. At the ranch, somebody ran into the yard, and he saw sunlight on a rifle barrel. He talked to the mare, and glancing back, saw a rifle leveled. There was a dip in the ground off to the left. He swung over and dropped into it, hearing the bullet go by. When he came out of the hollow, he let the mare have her head, and she started running all out, giving it everything she had. Old as she was a fine horse, and she loved to run. Then the others broke from the brush and trees and stretched out in a long line, swept down on the ranch, guns popping. Somebody fired from the ranch, and then he was racing into the yard. He swung an arm to indicate the attack was coming from all directions, and then rode the mare to the stable and, dropping to the ground, ran back. Johnny Otero was down behind a plank water trough, rifle ready, and Pete Gaddis came running from the bunkhouse carrying an extra cartridge belt. Otero fired first, and a gray horse running full tilt took a header, throwing its rider head over heels to the ground. The rider started to get up, and Otero fired again. Riders rushed into the ranch yard, and one man lifted a gun toward Otero. Flint fired his big game rifle, and the man was lifted from the saddle and smashed to the ground. It was close range now. Dropping the rifle, he sprang into the open and emptied his six-shooter into the racing riders. Then he switched guns with a border shift, throwing the empty gun to his left hand, the loaded gun to his right, opening fire so swiftly there was almost no break in the sound. I'm pretty sure I actually invented the border shift, just so you guys are aware. 2 saddles were emptied, and a man riding away seemed to turn in the saddle and fall, his foot hanging in the stirrup. The attack ended abruptly. Flames crackled up from a huge stack of hay. Otero had a bad burn across the top of his shoulder, but the defender suffered no other injuries. Flint loaded his pistols and recovered his rifle. At the stable, he stripped the saddle from the mare and, taking a handful of hay, gave her a swift rub-down, then threw an old blanket over her. He put grain in the feed box and hay in the manger. He was coming out of the stall when pain seized him, knotting his stomach with agony. He doubled over and caught the edge of the stall for support, then slid to his knees. Johnny Otero stepped into the door. "Hey, did you get hit?" Flint shook his head. Otero waited uncertain, then backed out and went to the house. Slowly the attack passed. Flint pulled himself erect. He spat. There was blood on the hay. He walked out of the barn, feeling weak and sick. He squinted his eyes against the sun and stood in the stable door for a minute, trying to fight his way back to composure. Otero came from the bunkhouse carrying an extra rifle, a second pistol tucked into his waistband. He glanced curiously at Flint. "You all right?" he asked. "All right," Flint said briefly. "There's more guns in the house," Otero said. There was a burst of firing from the west, and 2 riders came at the ranch on a dead run. "Hold your fire!" Otero yelled. "That's Julius." Julius dropped from the saddle in time to catch the other rider as he fell. The wounded man had been shot twice, through the leg and through the chest. Flint walked around the ranch yard studying the situation. The place was in good shape as long as daylight held, but with the small number of men they had to defend it, night attack was sure to end in disaster. The attackers could close in under cover of darkness and fire the buildings and shoot down the defenders as they emerged. No help could be expected from the outside. If Baldwin had thought to guard the telegraph station, it was doubtful if the territorial government would know of what was going on until the fight was over. And then Baldwin could say it was a fight between the big ranches and squatters. The telegraph station. Jim Flint paused in his pacing. The place to beat Baldwin was New York. The telegraph made it almost next door. He went to the house. "We've got to get out of here as soon as it's dark," he told Nancy. Gaddis nodded agreement. "He's right. They'll burn this place tonight whether we are in it or not." "Burn the ranch?" Nancy looked slowly around her, scarcely able to imagine life without this house. She had grown up here. There were marks. Hello. There were marks of her uncle and father all around, yet she knew that what Flint and Gaddis said was true. "We will need all the grub we can get together," she said, "and pack horses. I doubt if they will expect us to run." "Where'll we go?" Gaddis asked mildly. "There's only one place," Nancy said. "We will go to the hole in the wall." She turned to explain to Flint. "It's a lava-walled pasture, 12,000 acres of it. I doubt if any of Baldwin's men know it exists." Flint watched Nancy. He knew what this meant to her. This home was her life, her memories, all she had. "We'll have to take Flint," she said, "and leave Thomas." Thomas, the wounded rider, grinned at Flint. "Hell, you get me on a horse, that's all I ask. I rode 20 miles through a blizzard one time with a broke leg." When they were alone, Nancy turned to him. "Jim, I'm glad you're here." "Yes," he said. "I wouldn't want to be anywhere else." At her quick glance, he added, "At a time like this." He walked outside. The sun was a ball of fire over the Continental Divide. "You'll make a fool of yourself," he said aloud, "if you aren't careful." And that is chapter 8.